Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We are getting started. I'm just going to give a moment for everybody to join us. It is the top of the hour. And for those who have watched our webinars in the past, you know I love to start our webinars right on time. And we have such a packed agenda today with an incredible conversation that I just trust you're going to love as much as I did and the team at SaaSMAX did preparing it for you. Our webinar today is the power of story and brand in the B2B tech channel with our special guest, Tucker Stine. Let's dive right in and get going. Let's talk about our agenda and some housekeeping as well. At the end of the webinar, you're going to get a survey, and we would love it if you would fill that out. It's just a couple of quick questions to get us going forward. We We'll have questions because we love questions. For anybody who knows me personally, you know I am all about the questions. When you have a question during this webinar today, please type them in the question pane. We're going to be presenting for about 45 minutes and then go into Q&A, but type your questions throughout the webinar because as we go through it, if your question is something that we can loop right in during the webinar, we will drive that right in. We don't want you to have to wait if we don't need you to wait. Here's our agenda. We're going to start with the power of partner data and how to access it. Then we'll go into the power of story and brand, then dive deep into Tucker's formula for developing a brand story and narrative that connects you to your audience. That connection is key, as you'll hear as we keep speaking. Discover the critical conversations that need to happen between you and your partners, and introduce methodologies to help you define your partner and customer avatars and architect a story. And then we'll dive into the Q&A. So let's start with talking about the power of partner data. This loops so critically into your brand and partner conversations. In many industry sectors, let's talk about HR, online dating, sports, think Moneyball, Match.com, all of those. Finding and recruiting optimal talent is done by analytics, metrics, and scoring. It's been done forever in those industries, but not so much in our B2B tech industry. Now, my name is Laura Stewart. I'm the Director of Online Events for SaaSMAX Partner Optimizer, but I'm a former MSP. I had a 15-year multi-state MSP, and I can tell you that I got hit up most of the time by conversations with vendors who wanted me that knew nothing about me. There was no Moneyball. There was no Match.com. They bought a list. They did whatever they needed to. Data would have made such a difference to our conversation. As you can see on this slide, 80 to 90% of partners in the channel typically are not even active, and they're not active because we don't have the data in the channel to help us know what we need to know with our partners. It is a $2.4 trillion industry of products that are sold strictly through the channel. With SaaSMAX Partner Optimizer, one of the things that we add to the channel and why we really wanted to bring Tucker Stine into the conversation is because what if you could make a massive difference with your brand, with your products, with the success of your company by creating a different conversation with your partners because you have the data, like some of the data on this screen, partner personas, all of that. What if you had that data and crafted your conversations for that? We go into this kind of information more on some of our workshops, which if you're subscribed to us, you'll get information when we're holding our next one. I want to dive right in right now because with access to partner data and better prospects, how do you leverage that data in your story and your brand to close those prospects? And Tucker Stine is here to help us with that. So Tucker, welcome aboard. I want to do a little intro to you, and I know you hate this part of presenting more than anything else, right? Because you got to sit there as I tell everybody how awesome you are.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So one of the things I love about Tucker is, and Dina Moskowitz, the founder and CEO of SaaSMAX, just fell in love with Tucker, and you'll find out why shortly. He's a results-driven connector. He's a personal and organization. I cannot talk today, Tucker. Organizational brand architect, leadership coach, 25 years success helping companies like tech giants and global change makers, Microsoft, Accenture, Azure, F5, reinvent not only leadership, right, but brand conversations, strategic marketing initiatives. And here's something that I love so much about you, Tucker. You bring humanity back into the technology world. So everybody, welcome Tucker.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here.
There's so much that we can talk about around this conversation, Tucker. You know, about how data links to that conversation. We've seen in the world how often it seems that brands just don't even get who their customers are. They don't have the first clue as to the disconnects with what their conversations are. Can we dive in and talk to that and explain why it is so critical, Tucker?
I agree. Thank you for sharing that and that intro, and thank you everyone for being here today. And my goal and our goal, Laura and I have talked extensively about this, is to really bring a different kind of perspective to the industry and really challenge you and empower you to think differently about how you connect, how you market, how you tell stories, how you position yourself, not just the company or the channel that you represent or the product that you represent. And a lot of it is data driven. And one of the things that I wanted to start with is a quick thing that I often work with tech companies and thinking about it from this perspective. Data identifies, story connects, product solves, and brand reinforces. So when we think about it from that perspective, the first thing that we talked about is data. And so much of what is critical for us to understand and connect with our customers is, who are they? What makes them tick? What are their pain points? What are their challenges? The dangers of assuming that we know who they are far outweigh the benefits of using simple data to be able to calculate who our actual customers are. It's not necessarily a volume game when it comes down to it. It's a qualification game. It's really about the qualifications and the quality of the connections that it is the quantity. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is how do we enhance the quality and the character of what those relationships are going to look like. And that's what I love to inspire today. And you're right, Laura, I think one of the things that often either gets overlooked or misused is the data. And today we're going to talk about how data actually really informs a lot of the decisions on how we tell the stories. So this is a statement that I will say hands down has become probably the #1 challenge that any tech company I've ever worked with from a perspective of branding, leadership, training, whatever it is. Here's the challenge, is that when technology companies, when it comes to customer acquisition specifically and adoption, they market themselves as a product, not a brand, a feature, not a benefit, and there is a difference. So they end up solving a short-term problem and not building a long-term relationship. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to bring some clarity to today, is that often in this arena, we are forced to look at technology in a cutthroat environment where we are constantly trying to out-feature the other organization, the other company, the competitor. Really, it's not necessarily a game of outsmarting, but it's out connecting. And that's the power of what we're going to talk about today. So let's move on to the next slide, Laura. I want to look at this. This is a slide I've used many times before, and understanding and putting some context and defining certain things that we're going to talk about today, so that you're actually looking at different ways in which you can connect. Product versus brand, right? This is what I just spoke about. Oftentimes, we are so content on solving problems with products that we forget about the brand. And the brand ultimately is a collection of all of the experiences, the stories, the people, the assets, the successes, the accolades that actually drive product innovation. And if we only focus on the product, we're discounting the fact that part of our point of differentiation is going to be what the brand holds to be true. And that's what I want to have more dialogue on that today, Laura. Features versus benefits. Features are things that solve problems. Benefits are the outcomes of the features that create emotional connection, long-term relationships, long-term solutions, and how they feel about something. Features are the means to the benefits. And if we only focus on the features, we're ignoring the emotional connections or the long-term effects of what those features do for our customers. So that's the difference between the two. The next is pushing versus pulling. Historically, in the realm of sales and marketing, we have been in this motion of pushing information out. Get it out to the masses. Whatever we have, put it out there. The more that we have, the better. The more information that we have, the more features that we have, the better the promotion, the better the product, whatever it is, push it out there and hope that something sticks. That was great in the 90s. It was great in the early 2000s. But what we're learning is that innovation of social media, validation, Yelp, all of those things, we have to change that structure. The power of building tribe and community is what pulls people together. So think about shifting your mindset from pushing information out and pulling who you want to do business with in. That is also very much data driven. We can't pull the right people in if we don't know who they are. When we push out a bunch of information without having the data that identifies who we want to talk to, waste, resources, money spent on things that we don't need. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how our story and brand and those conversations, those connections that we make actually pull the right people together. It was, Laura said, I think it was like 90% inactive. We don't want to be discussing the inactive people, right? We're going to pull in the people, that 10% that are active, and make the most of those relationships. And then the last one on this slide, follower versus leader. Sometimes based on where you're at in the sales cycle or the distribution, the channel, wherever you're at, it's easier to be a follower than it is a leader. It's easier to take the information that we're given and we're told to put it out there in the market and we do it, right? That's being more of a follower. A leader takes the stance of owning the data, owning who they're speaking to, changing the narrative or adapting the narrative to meet the needs and the pain points of their existing customer. This is where it becomes important to have that one-on-one relationship versus selling to the masses. Again, pushing versus pulling. When you're a leader, you pull people together. When you're a follower, you're pushing things out. So that's what kind of I wanted to set up that paradigm shift today in order for us to think about how we're going to have those different kinds of conversations. Laura,
I
thoughts?
love this. Sorry, Tucker, go ahead.
I was just saying I was going to open up to you for thoughts.
What I love about this conversation is it reframes how that conversation between the different parts of the channel work. I just have a question or two in here for some clarification. One of the things that I see very often is product versus brand and understanding the difference between the two, because very often that conversation says that the product is the brand.
Right.
So how do you help the listeners today understand the difference? Because it's so critical, I believe, even to the rest of the presentation to see the difference between that.
Yeah, I think the best way to look at that is, product is a child of a parent, right? So if we look at a car company, let's look at, Toyota. Toyota is the brand name, but they've got probably 10 different models that all serve a different purpose for a certain kind of customer that has a certain kind of a need, and they solve it with that particular product. The product itself doesn't define the brand. The collection of the products, the fact that it's serving a vast amount of individuals, add to what the brand represents. The brand for let's say Volvo, right? We've talked about the fact that Volvo isn't necessarily the most expensive, it isn't the least expensive, but they're not basing their brand on price, they're basing it on safety. That is what their collection of products and the cars that they give out to the public is representative of. So the brand becomes what they stand for, which is safety. The products, the different kinds of vehicles, end up being the solutions for each kind of audience that they're speaking to. That to me would be the best representation of how to differentiate between product and brand.
And what if a company currently only has one product and they're not sure whether they're going to expand into multiple products? How does that description shift, or doesn't it shift?
Well, here's a perfect example of that. We just saw that with Facebook, right? Facebook started off as this social media platform with its own set of features, its own set of benefits, and now we're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar company, positioned as Meta because they did not want it to be defined as one product. So that's an example of where one product, as it was a brand, had to diversify. So part of that is taking what you know best, what is your overall mission, and sticking to that mission. So sometimes if you're identified by one brand or by one product, it's important that the product doesn't define the mission. The product is solving the problems of its customers. The brand's job is to define the mission of ultimately what is the impact that you want to make long term. Products are often focused on more short-term solving problems. The brand is creating impact for the long term. So differentiating between the two comes down to the way in which the messages are being marketed. Oftentimes a company that starts with one brand or one product, that becomes the lead, and that's what they're known for. But what Facebook ended up doing is saying, okay, well, now we've got multiple products. It's time to share our greater vision for what we see longer term versus just focusing on the immediate needs of one particular product. So there's an important thing if you only have one product, make sure you understand and everybody on the team and the company knows what the long-term mission is. That's going to be very valuable if you've got other products in that category where it's very saturated. If your mission stands out above anybody else's product, that is what's going to differentiate between you and other brands, if that makes sense.
And that adds a great piece to the second line item in here, which is features, benefits, pushing and pulling, understanding those two things. And I'm kind of getting, and I know we're going to talk about this further, but the follower versus leader, understanding what you just talked about, that brand, the mission, those different pieces, everybody, I would think, including a CEO at different points, is a follower or a leader to that conversation, and depending on the role they're taking at the time. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And you're right. Everyone, for all intents and purposes, is a follower to some degree. Only a few choose to be leaders. And I think that becomes the point of differentiation when it creates customer relationships or the dynamics that you're creating within your own organization. Followers tend to be put in the category of, how do I distinguish them? They're more of the same. Leaders stand out. So part of what we want to discuss today too, specifically, Laura, is how do we use stories and those connections we're making with our customers to create leadership opportunities. Followers stay and they receive the information, they push it out. And it goes, it's kind of like, here's my role, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Leaders take that information, they use the data, they use what they're learning and adapt and innovate. And that's what makes the stronger connection in order to become a leader. And that's where I want to shift the follower notion into the leadership notion.
Well, that's a perfect seg to the next slide.
Yeah, no, this is, I want to say 15 years ago, one of the mentors in my industry, in the marketing world, told me this, and I have not forgotten it. And as humans, we buy on emotion and justify with logic. It doesn't get any more authentically true than that. And unfortunately, when you get into highly competitive space, a lot of which is driven by technology, some companies have shifted when you're follower focused and you're overly product focused. They've twisted that around to be buying on logic and then justify with emotion later. The danger of that is you become into that competitive soup. How do you stand out from somebody else? And at the end of the day, we have to remember that technology is still solving a problem for human beings. Human beings are still part of what we are trying to connect with. We're not trying to connect a piece of technology with another piece of technology. And at the end of the day, emotional connections are still going to drive a leadership role versus a follower role. So I wanted to share this because oftentimes I feel like technology companies that are struggling or are stuck in that follower soup struggle to bring the humanity back to the product they're selling. Because at the end of the day, the technology companies that tend to soar are the ones that bring humanity back into it and know exactly who they're talking to and use the power of brand and story to create that emotional connection. And I want to challenge everyone today to bring that humanity back if you're struggling with making those connections with partners and customers.
Yeah, the one thing that popped out right when you were saying that was this story, true story, of when I was an MSP, and we're looking at everything, and we've been trying to get a client to buy some higher level cybersecurity prevention. And they're like, no, 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 it's never going to happen to us. It's never going to happen to us. And, our backups will always work. We'll be fine. And they had a friend who got hit and their backups didn't work. And they were down for months and months, and, it basically destroyed their business. We got a phone call the next day.
Mm-hmm.
They bought on emotion.
Yeah.
They didn't buy, it wasn't logic to it, because the logic was what we presented. Telling them stories that emotionally hit them made a massive difference.
Right. And I
Addressing
think
the pain
that's
points.
just as important, right? No, and I think what you bring up too, Laura, which is great, is it's not enough to just have the emotion. There has to be the justification with logic.
Right.
So that this statement does not work. As humans, we buy on emotion without having the justification with logic. Because you're right, you can have the most emotional connection in the world, but if your product cannot be justified and doesn't have the track record, it's always going to fail. So this leads me to this one little word, and it's one of my favorite words, and it's voice. And I think oftentimes it is the most overlooked tool that all of us own, and it's completely free. And this comes back down to that concept of the follow and leader too. Oftentimes as followers, the voice component is the silenced component. Whereas when we move into a leadership role, this is where the power of voice becomes so evident. And what I wanted to discuss particularly right now, Laura, is this difference and the power of the personal brand versus the corporate brand. And we're often told that as if we work for a large company that, we work for the brand. Well, yes, you work for a brand, but you also represent the brand and yourself. And the first thing, besides a corporate brand, that a customer or partner is going to interact with is you. And the most important thing is that you create a brand of yourself, which is all a collection of the experiences, the stories, the positives and the negatives of who you are as an individual and how you communicate with others. That's first and foremost. That is your personal brand. Who are you known for? We all know those certain individuals in the industry that they call them the staples, or they're the epitome of the brand or the epitome of this particular role. And it's because they've established a personal brand that is so powerful within the marketplace. That is the first brand they're going to see. The corporate brand reinforces. And I want to go back to what I said originally at the beginning. Data identifies, story and voice connects, the product solves, and the brand reinforces. So it's really important that that corporate brand not be the lead, but that you as the individual, if part of your role and responsibility is to be a voice, make sure you're comfortable and 100% confident in your own voice. That's the personal brand that's going to make a huge difference, whether or not they select you or somebody else. So that's what I wanted to make note here. So Laura, if we can go on to the next slide, if there are any other comments.
Well, I always have comments, but I'm gonna let it roll through to the next one. Okay.
Yeah. So this is where the power of story comes into play. And oftentimes we hear in large corporations or in the sales world that our personal stories, whatever they look like, don't belong in the workplace. Or the story that we're supposed to be telling is one that's been manufactured or given from, at this level, and then it trickles down into the sales environment. or the marketing environment. I call that the old telephone effect. If it starts one place and it goes through multiple channels to get to you, and you're responsible for delivering that story, oftentimes either one doesn't connect, two it's now misinformed because it's gone through multiple individuals, and the fact that is not accurate because you're the one that has the primary data and the feedback that you're getting from customers and partners. And if there's a disconnect there, you're going to lose every time. So this is where the power of story comes into play. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's a universal story that's adopted by the company. It's how the story that you tell that's attaching itself to the pain points and the challenges of your customers that is the most critical. So there's a difference between the corporate story and the personal story. And today what we're going to talk about specifically is how do we architect our own stories, whether it be personal or through the eyes of our customers. How do we architect those stories in a narrative format and a formula that allows us to create deeper connections and activate more partners and customers?
When you and I were prepping for the webinar and just listening to you again, because every time I listen to you, Tucker, it's like I peeled the onion a bit more in the conversation. Looking at the voice slide, listening to everything you said there, and then on the story side, what comes up for me is this idea of our voice and our story can have much more impact if we can craft those stories and our voice based on who we're presenting to, which you've delivered lots of keynotes, I've delivered keynotes, we've helped other people do that. Data makes a huge difference. But for some people, the data that they're working with might not be the right data for the story that they maybe want to tell. So how does that play in to make sure you don't become that person who says, oh, I'm going to manipulate the statistics for this, but that you actually are using the full data for your voice and your story?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind, Lauren, and I think that's actually a really good question. And that's one of the reasons why I'm somewhat of a data geek, because it's very easy for data to change very quickly. We've seen that in the pandemic. The data, if you have not run certain data or have research that hasn't been done after 2019, things have drastically changed. 25 or 50% of the world's population right now is 25 and under. I mean, that's a very, very critical data point. 65% of Americans started looking for a new job in the last couple of years, and only 20% are actually passionate about what they do. The pandemic has radically changed the mindset of a lot of individuals. So data is critical to constantly mine over and over again because it is volatile and it is changing constantly. Using data that's a year old, 2 years old can be very dangerous. Data doesn't always have to be in the form of numbers and charts and graphs and tables and all that stuff that we can run and put out reports. Data can be firsthand. I encourage anyone who's in the sales field or the marketing world to pinpoint 5 champion customers and interview them every single year. What's working, what's not working, what are the things you're coming up against, what are the challenges, so that you constantly have a test on what's happening in the marketplace. That is what, and it's going to make your story and the way in which you deliver the narrative a lot more effective than it is using old data. So the concept of bringing up data is a good one, because assumption is the death of any kind of customer acquisition. And it's okay nowadays, and we're going to get into a little bit more, to be vulnerable enough to look imperfect, or to say, I don't have the right answer, but if you can help me, I will deliver a solution that makes sense for you. To have more of those raw, honest communications, the more vulnerable communications in those conversations, changes the way in which people view you. So it's kind of like the old, and even Zoom has done this for all of us. Many of us used to wear a coat and a tie and this and that. Well, we don't do that anymore, right? I had a client once that said, I need you to dress down because you make me feel uncomfortable. We have to start acting and communicating the way in which and where our customers are at. And if we don't know where they're at, we could be missing the mark every single time. And data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, can help determine those next steps.
All right, you threw a piece of data at us when I asked the question that 50% of the business world, it's the conversation is under 25. Inside the channel, we still see that 70% of the owners of the companies that those on the webinar, the channel chiefs and everybody on our webinar today are targeting are still typically an older set of population. They're older than 25, but the people inside the organizations are probably younger, closer to that 25, maybe 25 to 40 realm, and you have newer people coming in. How critical is it, or not critical, to have a multi-generational story to tell based on who you are going to be talking to at the time? If the business owners are 60 plus and come from a different world versus the newer companies that are starting, I mean, how do you target that conversation with your story?
It's one that I get all the time, and there's, we have this historical organizational structure of top down, and we've got leadership down and that perspective. Having been in this business for a long time and seen the power of storytelling in business, the number one person in the company for acquisition is the customer facing person. They have to be treated with respect and the same level of acknowledgement, because they are the goal, they are the gateway. We have to be able to support the gateway, otherwise we're not going to be able to compete. So part of that, again, is using data and looking to see what is it in the marketplace, how are our customers digesting information, what's working, so that actually it becomes a field up, understanding the power of the field. 81% of people nowadays choose to consume their information from video, which is why Instagram and TikTok especially have taken off on the social platforms, because it's video content. We've become lazy. We don't like to read as much. And at the end of the day, we have 5 to 8 seconds to capture someone's attention, and we get it more through video than we do through reading. That's the kind of information that we need to get out and understand in how we deliver our messages and the way our stories are delivered. If we're using old school ways of doing things, we're losing out to those that are being, progressive and are modernizing the way in which they're connecting. So part of the story isn't just what words you're using, it's the way in which you're delivering it. So it is very critical that some of those top-down structures are understanding that the information and the decisions need to be made from data that's coming out of this part of the organization. It needs to go from bottom up. And I want to move on and time. Story. 3 critical words that stories do for us: relatability, vulnerability, and trust. Foundation for any solid relationship or customer relationship. Relatability is so critical. You understand where I'm coming from. I understand. I've walked in your shoes. I get that. That's why comedians are so, connect so well with their audience, is because they're literally taking everything that they can relate to and creating humor to connect them. Vulnerability. I see you, I hear you, I understand you. Vulnerability is becoming one of those words where it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to be transparent, because the more transparent and the more honest you are, the more that we actually create that level of trust. And trust being the most critical word on this slide. Trust will win over every single time. You may have 2 products that do the exact same thing, same cost, same deliverable, whatever it is, but the trust is what's going to decide. And what does that go back to? Emotion, logic.
I remember back in the day, Frank Vitigliano was the primary channel person for IBM. And if Frank spoke, everybody believed whatever Frank said, and then he left.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of concern inside the channel from my side of the channel. Can we believe who the next voice is, who the next face is? How does that play into, for the channel chiefs that are listening, the conversation about keeping relatability, vulnerability, and trust with your brand, with your story. Should there be a face? Should there not be a face? What happens if that face leaves?
That's a very good question, and you see that in a lot of brands. And often the person identifies and basically becomes the spokesperson or the face of the brand. This goes back to the follower leader concept, and I think where a lot of companies struggle is the idea of putting too many eggs in one basket. So they've got too many followers and not enough leaders. And one of the reasons why I love doing presentations like this is my mission out of webinars like this is to empower anyone and everyone to put themselves and position themselves in a leadership role. That way, if someone who has more years in the industry, a little bit more face time, a little bit more recognition or relatability in terms of their track record, those that are next in line, so to speak, have already built up their own set of brand awareness, their own tribe, their own community, so that if somebody does leave, someone can easily rise to the occasion. We're not starting from ground zero. So part of what I'm trying to accomplish here today is empowering anyone who feels as though they're not in that leadership role and they're still kind of in that follower area. This is the time to do it. And the best way to start doing that is using your story, your personal brand to build that. There's nobody stopping you from doing that. And I think anyone and everyone can start to build that leadership role so that you, instead of having a team of followers, you have a team of leaders that are collectively building the bigger brand. And it's not, on one person's shoulders to be the face of the brand. It's the collective team. I'd rather work with a company that's known for its leadership on all levels than to have one person that stands above everybody else. It's like that, building a, here in California, we have a lot of earthquakes. It's like building a castle on sand. It'll just completely, there's no foundation. So what it is allowing people to step into that foundational role and using brand to build a stronger structure.
I love that. So let's dive deeper in and go on to this.
Absolutely. So this is a 5-step approach to what I call the anatomy of a story I have used for years, and I love it. It works, and it can literally be applied to anything and everything as it relates to story. And even practicing this sometimes allows you to connect with your own team. It allows you to get more speaking opportunities, and when you do have a speaking opportunity, it allows you to really convey your message and connect with your audience. On a side note, I had a friend who used this same structure because he's also a past client of mine as a best man speech. And he goes, Tucker, you know what? You're right. It works on anything. So I encourage you to look at this 5-step process any way that you can. So let's look at the anatomy of the story. Moment of engagement, right? It's very easy sometimes when we're in sales and marketing to want to jump to the solution. We have the solution. We've got it. Listen to the solution. Listen to the solution. The solution should never drive the story. Find that moment of engagement first. This is where data becomes really critical. What is it that you can capture their attention right away? Give you a quick example. A woman I was working with came up with this phenomenal technology, smart apparel for kids. That's washable, wearable, GPS attaches to your phone. You can track your kid anywhere that it is, whether it's at daycare, whether it's at school, whether they're out playing, whatever it is. And she focused everything on the solution as she was pitching me. And I finally asked her, I said, why did you come up with this technology? And she said, well, I'm ashamed to say it. I said, go ahead and tell me. And she said, when my daughter was 2, I lost her in the shopping mall. Boom, silence. That's your moment of engagement. And she switched her pitch around. Next day, she won a $10,000 prize, whatever it was. That's how she opens all of her pitches now, is that moment of engagement as to her greater why. Second, pinpoint the pain point. This is the most critical after the moment of engagement. If you don't know the pain points over your audience, you're not going to be able to acquire. It's okay to lead with pain. Pain alludes to purpose, right? Identify what's going on in their lives, what's working for the company, what's not working. Get to where they're at, because those that can address the pain first build the trust, they build the connection, and they're going to get the job done. Now the solution comes into play. Then you unveil the solution, because now you've built the engagement, you've built the trust, so naturally the solution lends itself to a no-brainer. And then impact of adoption. This is something that people leave out sometimes. What does success look like short-term and long-term? If the solution works, this is what you can expect. Allow your customers to visualize the end. It's not a matter of just solving the problem. They need to go back and be able to say, and maybe it's their team, their executive, their director, whoever it is, to say, this is what success could look like for us short-term and long-term. So don't forget that impact of adoption. And then finally, invitation to join. Used to use call to action, closing, whatever you want to look at it. I use invitation to join. When you invite somebody in to be a part of something, it's less of that awkwardness of trying to close somebody. Allow them to become part of something. Invite them into the solution rather than sell them the solution. And sometimes that invitation to join allows you to open the door for multiple products. It allows you to create even more open doors and allow that spider effect to penetrate the organization. So I just want to encourage you to look at that 5-step process as a way of framing a 60-second pitch, a 5-minute story, a 45-minute keynote, whatever that might look like. This is a kind of structure for building a story that I've found to work every single time.
And I know on the next slide, you are actually going to take us through that process. So go right ahead. Can you hear me? Can you see the slide? It didn't change. Tucker, can you hear me? Tucker, are you there? Okay, I'm hoping that others can hear me. If you can hear me, put in the chat that you can hear me so that I know I'm not just talking out into the ether.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, great. So it's just Tucker that is frozen. Thank you, Dina. One of the things that Tucker was just talking about was how you craft your story, how you craft your pitch. And one of the things we started looking at deeply when we were talking about this were some consumer brands that haven't necessarily been really astute at some of this when they made some changes. You know how earlier in the conversation we talked about what if somebody left. Think about Alex Trebek and Jeopardy. It really jeopardized the Jeopardy brand when he passed away with all of the chaos around who was going to take over that role. As Tucker talked about, having that additional leaders coming up throughout your organization who have built story, who have built relationships at all levels of your partner engagement becomes very critical into the conversation. When we talked about the generational conversation, look at Subaru. They have different ways of pitching based on who they are talking to. If you've ever seen the Subaru commercial, they've got one that has the millennial generation and younger driving the cars out into adventure and nomadic and doing whatever they want. That really came up a lot during the time of COVID. Then you have this other part of the conversation where you have Subaru parents passing on the car to the younger generation. Look at your story, look at your brand as you're crafting it, look at the data that you have about your companies to craft that story and that brand. I'm hoping that Tucker will be able to join us shortly. Let's now go into one other part of the agenda while we're waiting for him to come in, and please feel free to type your questions into the question pane. One of the things that Partner Optimizer by SaaSMAX does is we offer you some of the tools to help you get the data you need to create those stories, to create that voice and that conversation. And we do have a special offer that we are offering and that Tucker is also offering to you. And Dina, if it's possible for you, if you're listening right now, can you go text out Tucker and see if he can get back on his internet? Partner Optimizer by SaaSMAX, we are offering you a free analysis of your total addressable partner market, and you can reach out, send an email to me, and my email is on the screen. You can also get a discovery session with Tucker. And yes, we are going to be recording this. Somebody just asked a question about that. We will send the recording out to you. For me, the big question that becomes around this conversation, oh, and Tucker is back, yes.
But Microsoft decided that it was not my time to have this, so it crashed on me. So I'm back. Sorry about that interruption.
Oh, no, it's fine. I had a lot of fun just riffing on different parts of the
I mean, it
conversation.
literally went black and I went, you've got to be kidding me.
Okay, so while we have you back and we're waiting for some additional questions to come in, you were going to tie your slide of the anatomy of the story and the pitch with the 5 pieces and give us some examples. I ran through Alex Trebek and Jeopardy and how that changed it because they didn't have enough other leaders inside the organization to begin to step up. And then also the Subaru generational conversation as well about how during COVID, they started having more of the adventure, the nomadic, use Subaru to get out, but they also had the parents transferring the Subarus to their next generation and how data came into that. So now, Tucker, I will let you pick up from there.
No, I think that's great. I know those were some of the examples we wanted to talk about. And I think one of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit, just as a side note to that anatomy, if you look at a company like Verizon a few years back, their entire campaign, "Can you hear me now?" was literally a derivative of the #1 pain point that customers in the United States were facing. Their calls were getting dropped. So they literally built an entire campaign around a pain point. So one of the things I wanted to encourage is don't be afraid, again, to lead with pain. Maybe pain's a little bit of a hard word, use challenge or whatever the struggle is, but it's okay to address head on what that looks like. Sometimes when we stay too much in the solution with the way we market things, it can easily get overshadowed by everybody else that's saying the same thing. We talked a little bit about cybersecurity in the way in which it seems like every company says the exact same thing. What makes you different? Well, what stood out for Verizon in a very competitive red ocean with the wireless industry is they decided rather than focus on the solution, I'm going to address the pain point right off the bat and allow customers to say, I can relate to that. I get that. And they had a huge surge in transfer and signups. So don't be afraid to bring in the challenge as a form of bringing people in. So I wanted to kind of show where that pain comes in. I think you noted on the Subaru. We talked a little bit about Volvo. Look at somebody like a Target, right? Target was an example of a dying brand, literally a dying brand that was basically getting swept under the rug and said that it doesn't belong here anymore. It looked specifically for the customer that it wanted to have. It wasn't a Walmart and it wasn't a Nordstrom. They needed something in between to address people that didn't have as much money but still aspired to be in that kind of brand conscious world. And that's what they did. They completely breathed life into a company. I heard the woman who came up with the new campaign speak years ago. And the #1 thing that they listened to had nothing to do with their competition, had nothing to do with what corporate was saying, had nothing to do with what they were going to put in. They listened to the data and their customers first. They did extensive amounts of research in order to identify who their target market was going to be. So I wanted to kind of bring that as Target, reinvented themselves because of customer-driven data. But I think you covered some of the other ones, Laura.
It's okay. We had so much fun, you and I riffing on some of these different examples. I wasn't aware of that whole Target piece, so I find that really interesting with the data, how they were able to target that. There's a question that's coming out there that we have posted out there right now. There's a couple of versions of it, so forgive me as I try to paraphrase this to combine all the thoughts into one question. We hear a lot about unique value proposition, but you just described the red ocean of, say, the Verizon and the wireless carriers. Cybersecurity is a red ocean in a lot of ways. A lot of the tech products are red ocean. the blue ocean stuff of there's not a lot of people out there, there's not a lot of chum in the water, there's not a lot of channel out there. So the question is, in an area that's maybe not pure red, not blue, it's somewhere in the middle, does it have to be unique? How can you begin to figure out your differentiation so that with the data, you can have the right conversations and set your brand up correctly? I hope
You
I
bring up
paraphrase that in a way it makes sense.
No, I understand what you're trying to say. And I think one of the things, and I just did this with another organization, we were going through unique value propositions, key performance indicators, the whole thing. How do we reassess how we're measuring and talking about things? And what it came down to was their selling propositions were all based off of the features and not on the benefits. So what helped them, so what they were doing is basically trying to get out of the red ocean of features and not enough into the benefits. So what was really powerful was to realign a lot of them had similar rings to them, similar tones of the story, but going back to what's in it for the customer long term. How's it going to make them think, act, and feel? If it's not just solving a short-term thing, maybe the value propositions need to be out of the box thinking, longer term, whatever it is. So sometimes making sure that the value propositions aren't based solely on features, but are they based on powerful benefits? That's one way to look at it.
And I think the great way is, you mentioned earlier that at least once a year, talk to your top partners to understand even how they're using it, how they're pitching it, get the data, use something perhaps like Partner Optimizer so that you understand more about your partners. But even with that, the more data you have, the better you can craft that conversation and excel and differentiate yourself. Because I don't know, I see this. One of the things I love about working with the team at SaaSMAX and Partner Optimizer is they're willing to ask the questions. They're willing to say, well, what do you think differentiates us? What excels for you about that? And I find a lot of times in the channel, they don't want to ask. I don't know if they're afraid to ask because they don't want the answer. It might go against their brand. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there is, and this is one of those things that is a little bit around the psychology of branding, right? Because when we talk about storytelling and in branding, there are going to be those moments that feel a little bit awkward or challenging, or I'm stepping into a space that's almost foreign. But I will often say too that be careful that that isn't hidden by complacency. Are you just settling for what's happening in the market, settling for the way in which you're marketing or connecting with individuals? Storytelling isn't going to always be this, pie in the sky, unicorn, rainbow kind of approach. There are going to be some tough conversations to happen. And sometimes breaking down old traditions or old ways in which you've been thinking is part of the challenge. And it's habit. We're creatures of habit. We get comfortable in certain things. But the storytelling, there's going to be some fear around it. There's going to be some uncomfortableness around it. If there is, that probably means that it's working. If there's not some challenge to back and forth what the story is going to be, then maybe the story isn't strong enough. So part of really working with the team and looking at storytelling is having those tough conversations. Are we able to look at our weaknesses and address them and change them? Don't just push them aside and say, they're not the right customer. Think about what those negatives or that feedback loop is telling us. I worked with a company recently where they literally took only the positive comments from the research from their customers and tossed the negative comments. They didn't want to face them, right? So part of this is re-engineering, and it's even more important to look at the problems than it is necessarily the good comments. It creates some tough conversations, but those are the ones that are going to need the most addressing. And oftentimes out of those tougher conversations come the best value propositions and the best points of differentiation, because you're overcoming some of the biggest barriers to entry.
Got it. Okay, there is another question that has come in. How do you know when an employee or staff person's, even if it's the CEO, personal brand is over overarching, overpowering the company brand?
Is the question specifically, how do you know if it is?
They said no, and I'm wondering if it's more than that. Perhaps they're having an issue inside where maybe a staff member has a lot of social media that may not necessarily be quite along the lines of company brand.
Yeah, if I were to answer that question, I think part of it too is, again, as a team evaluating the ways in which the brand is being delivered to the consumer. This has come up multiple times when the leader is using social media either incorrectly or using too much personal information to drive other things, and they're mixing and matching things.
And they also talked about staff too. So it's not just the higher levels, it's the lower levels as well.
Part of it is, and because social media has created really good things and some really bad things, part of it is adopting new policy, right? And every company should have a social media policy for any and every member of the team, whether it's executive or all the way down the chain, because best practices on that is going to determine how things are communicated. That also allows for the team, if there is let's call it a breach of social contract, it allows the team to say, hey, we agreed to this. We need to remind us of where our values are. So part of that is adopting literally a brand policy. And one of the things that we're encouraging, brand standards isn't just about look and feel. Now it's about what kinds of stories, what kinds of customers we showcase, social media, how we show up in the world where we all have the ability to get in front of people, 24/7. So make sure that your social policy specifically is part of the brand standards. Also, part of social culture is enabling and empowering other individuals to be able to showcase the brand. Allow people to do some professional development around public speaking. Create more opportunities where instead of the CEO or the CMO, whoever's doing some speaking, empower other people in the organization to do it. You're creating a succession plan by doing that too. So you're enhancing the brand from multiple perspectives, but you're also succession planning if for some reason that person were to leave. So part of it is very much procedural and policy driven.
Okay, and we are almost out of time. So Tucker, share your last thoughts for our listeners today.
Well, one, thank you for having me. I think first and foremost, I want to go back to reminding us in the technology space, don't forget the humanity. And what I mean by that specifically is we all have incredible technology and products to sell, but at the end of the day, we're still working with humans that are having problems that need to be solved. So find ways in which you can connect with your customers on a deeper level. Allow yourself to use your own personal brand to drive business development. Think a little bit differently about how you've been communicating. If you feel like it's status quo or you're in that mode of complacency, step it up, step out of the box. Empower your team to think differently. Reevaluate your value propositions. Are they focused on features or are they focusing on customer benefits? How they're going to think, act, and feel in the future. And allow ourselves to really look at data as our best friend, because some of the best stories are going to be told if we know exactly who we're talking to. And that's what I think where I would leave.
I love that. And people can schedule a discovery session with you by sending an email to tuckerstine@gmail.com or going to your website, tuckerstine.com.
Great.
It's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. It's always fun talking to you.
Oh, and it's great. And I love being in a space that brings some different perspectives. So I hope that's what everyone took away with today.
Absolutely. And to those listening, we also have an offer, as I mentioned earlier, from Partner Optimizer by SaaSMAX for partner data and discovery demo and a free analysis of your total addressable partner market. You can reach out to me or anybody at the team at SaaSMAX. And we'd love to help you work with it, because imagine if you could quantify which partners you should invest in. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. It's been a lot of fun. Please answer the survey questions at the end. And thank you again, Tucker.
Thank you, Laura, for having me.